Kingsbane. Written by Clint Dawson. Narrated by Jez Jameson. Chapter 11. Alexander, Part 3. Darkness loomed from beyond the cast-iron door. The cries had gone silent. Olivia felt the hairs on the back of her neck raise. She grabbed Alexander's arm as he stepped towards the door.
"Do you have a death wish?"
she asked him curtly. Alexander shrugged her off. "The only way is forward. What would you suggest we do?" Ezekiel hastened to the gate leading down the staircase. "If 12 people can't get a gate open, then we deserve to die." "It's sealed. There's nothing we can do." Ezekiel shriveled his face. Stepping up to Alexander, he counted. "Hocus, bocus, pocus. That's total shite." Alexander gave Ezekiel a doubtful look. "So sure? For followers of the old religion, you seem quick to disregard the magic you see with your own eyes." "No, it's some trick, Lord. I have seen optical illusions before." "All 12 of us are seeing the same thing." Alexander waved his hand to the sky and the gate. "The clouded sky and rain from nowhere, the gate that locks on its own."
"Is anyone going to acknowledge the blood-chilling shrieks we heard from the tower?"
demanded Olivia. She shivered uncontrollably. Alexander did not respond as he looked away from Olivia. Turned towards the door, he walked inside without hesitation. No one followed him. As Alexander inched forward in the darkness, he smelled a faint, bitter odour. He could not make out what it was, but it was harsh. He could taste the bitter fragrance in his mouth. A stifled breeze brushed on Alexander's face. It was coming from underneath him. He dropped to his knees, feeling around on all fours. His breath was slow and measured. His breathing was the only sound he could hear. As he continued crawling forward, the light from outside grew faint. After a few moments, his hands no longer felt the wooden floor. He was touching stone. It was chilly to the touch, and the draft Alexander felt was becoming more apparent.
"Must be near a stairwell,"
Alexander thought to himself.
"Yes, another gate."
"Come!" Alexander called aloud. He pulled himself up against the steel railing in front of him. Before him was another iron-slated doorway. "Come!" Alexander called again. Olivia and Ezekiel stood outside the doorway, hesitant to enter. They exchanged glances. The other sailors pushed past them, readying their weapons. Ezekiel muttered some inaudible curses and followed after them. Olivia was following so closely she bumped into him from behind.
"Careful now,"
Ezekiel hissed.
"That's how you get stuck, lady. Back off a bit."
The men began muttering in prayer in the ancient common tongue.
"You cannot see me, Alexander, but I'm rolling my eyes right now,"
Olivia said in response to the prayers.
"The gods cannot help us."
As the sailors continued to repeat the prayer, a host of walled torches around the circular room lit up, immediately illuminating the room. Alexander jumped to his feet. The men stopped their prayer in unison, weapons in hand as they scanned the room.
"What is this place?"
pondered Olivia as windows appeared around the room.
"Did the windows turn to openings from stone?"
Ezekiel brandished his axe, pointing to an opening in the wall in front of him.
"I told you,"
started Alexander, brushing the dust from his knees and hands.
"It's magic."
The room was lightly decorated. There were chairs along the walls, with weapon racks spaced around 4 in number. The weapons on them were unknown to the group, although they were spear-like in nature. A table was in the room's centre and had several papers on it. Olivia peered over the parchments, which were worn, dusty, and dishevelled across the table.
"The same language as the scroll."
"The what?" questioned Ezekiel. He watched Olivia with trepidation. "Never mind." Alexander quickened to the table to look over the papers. He turned to Ezekiel. "Can you decipher any of this?"
"What makes you think I can read any of this?"
"It is the language of the ancients. You pray to the old gods."
"We recite prayers. I cannot read or speak the language outright," Ezekiel explained.
Alexander appeared irritated. He snatched up a piece of paper and brought it to the torchlight for a closer look. The scribblings on the parchment were in longhand, deep, definitive strokes. It all looked like rubbish to him.
"What do we do now? There is no way back. And we are surely not going down into the tower. This is obviously a prison, Olivia concluded.
Alexander did not pay any attention to her. Instead, he meandered from the torchlight back to the table. Tossing the parchment on the table, he folded his arms and looked back out the iron-cast door. From the winding stairwell behind the inside-gated door, a shadow of a figure emerged. The figure was almost translucent and gossamer. Its head had long, mangled grey hair, accompanied by a sunken face and deep purple eyes. Alexander and crew were focused on other things, such as the parchments, peering out the windows onto the clearing below, or out on the scaffolding trying to open the locked gate. Olivia looked transfixed, staring at the figure. She opened her mouth, heartbeat quickening. Even so, no sound came out. The figure cocked its head and stared back at her, orbs of light protruding from its eye sockets. Olivia's throat was dry. She raised her arm and extended her finger, pointing at the gate. Alexander, still hunched over the table, had his back to the stairwell gate. "We need to take all these papers and get back to the ship. We'll go across the channel to the southern island and look for signs of life." Ezekiel drew his weapon and approached the stairwell where the figure was wailing.
"What the hell is that thing?"
Alexander pulled Ezekiel back from the stairwell.
"Get away from there!" "Is that a ghost?"
questioned one of the sailors.
"By the gods!"
Ezekiel shrugged Alexander off and stepped closer to the gate.
"I would not get closer,"
cautioned Alexander. Ezekiel squared up his shoulders, facing off against the figure.
"I am not afraid of ghosts, Lord."
Alexander gathered up the papers on the table and handed them to one of the men. Olivia moved behind Alexander, her face flushed of all colour as she clutched at his shirt.
"We need to leave. Now!"
Alexander yelled, his voice cracking. As Alexander and Olivia backed away towards the tower's entrance, the rest of the men rushed past them into the walkway. All of them except Ezekiel, who stood transfixed, squaring off against the spectre. The crew began hacking away at the locked gate, but to no avail. Their frantic attempts to break open the lock were unsuccessful. It was as if some invisible force glanced off their repeated blows.
"Ezekiel!"
Alexander called sternly. Ezekiel stepped forward, inches from the stairwell gate. The spectre reached out a wispy arm, which went right through him. Olivia gasped loudly as she exhaled.
"This is black magic! This is black magic!"
Ezekiel laughed as he stepped away from the spectre, its arm still outstretched.
"See? It cannot harm us! Do not play with it, man! I beg you, walk away!"
Olivia tugged at Alexander's shirt, one foot already on the outside walkway. Alexander cautiously backed up a step.
"Ezekiel, come now! That's an order!"
Ezekiel turned away from the spectre and shrugged his shoulders.
"As you wish. I am scared of no ghost. I wish it would come to me. I would fight it like any other man!"
Ezekiel snickered loudly. Olivia let out a gasp as the spectre floated through the gated bars and hovered over Ezekiel. Its eyes illuminated brighter as it wrapped its arms around him. This time it did not penetrate through his body. Ezekiel, his eyes wide with surprise, began to thrash about. As he moved about the room, the spectre moved with him, latched around his upper torso.
"What is this devilry? Sod off!"
Ezekiel exclaimed. Outside the tower entrance, the sound of battle axes hammering on the gate intensified. The men began to panic as Ezekiel began shouting obscenities at the ghost. Olivia turned and ran out of the tower, leaving Alexander alone in the room with Ezekiel. Alexander watched as the spectre began to dissolve into Ezekiel's skin. Alexander stood transfixed as he could do nothing but watch Ezekiel writhing about in pain, screaming and cursing. Ezekiel was clawing at his skin, trying to pull the spectre off of him. He had a confused look on his face as he was able to physically grab hold of the spectre briefly as it seemed to take shape in his hold for a few seconds. The cries from the spectre intensified the more it dissolved into Ezekiel's flesh. Seemingly from the shadowy void of the stairwell, additional screams came from the darkness, wailing multiplied in unison. Alexander did not hear Olivia's repeated calls to leave the tower. As the spectre's wispy figure completely disappeared beneath Ezekiel's skin, Ezekiel buckled over. Abruptly, the wailing ceased. No sound emerged from the tower below. Ezekiel's cries of pain and cursing had stopped. Alexander took a few steps forward, clenching and unclenching his fists as he did so. He gazed at Ezekiel, looking for any sign of movement. "Ezekiel!" he started softly. Receiving no response, Alexander hesitantly approached him. From the platform, Olivia called out to Alexander, "It's opening! Alexander, it is open! The gate is open!" As Ezekiel's body began to emit a translucent purple haze, Alexander stopped cold in his tracks. He could hear the men and Olivia outside, scattered down the steps outside the tower. "Ezekiel!" Alexander extended an arm forward. The haze around Ezekiel started to dissipate. As he lifted his head, his eyes gleamed purple. Alexander had a crooked smile on his face. Opening his mouth, he let out a guttural sound, a cross between a deep yawn and hiss. He turned and faced Alexander directly.
"Hello, master,"
he exclaimed hoarsely. "What? What happened to you?" Alexander was too intrigued to be scared. Ezekiel stepped forward, slowly in a stagger. It was as if he was learning to walk for the first time. He rotated his neck, cracking it in several places. Rolling his shoulders, he leaned forward as he almost fell into the table at the center of the room.
"You don't belong here,"
Ezekiel hissed violently. "What's wrong with you? Why aren't you responding to me?" questioned Alexander in an agitated tone.
"You are too early. It is not time."
"Not time for what? Ezekiel, are you possessed?" Alexander walked to the other end of the table, leaning forward. He noticed that Ezekiel's face had sunken, the skin black around his eyes. Ezekiel shook his head violently, snapping his neck multiple times as he did so.
No, I am not. I am me."
"I am not scared of you, whoever you are. This place, this magic. You are tied down to this tower." Alexander's face crinkled in defiance. Ezekiel chuckled as he swiveled his head back and forth.
"You should run while you still can."
"What are you?" Alexander slammed his fist down on the table. "What is this place?" Ezekiel stood silent, trying to regain his footing. He was slowly starting to stand again on his own feet without the support of the table.
"We are in the Tower of the Undying. We are Amendi."
The shrill cries began again as he slowly backed away. Alexander spun around and ran out onto the tower platform. Looking down the outer stairwell, he saw the gates to the clearing wide open. Looking back into the tower, he saw Ezekiel's purple eyes shimmering in the darkness. Without another moment's hesitation, he began running down the winding stairs. Halfway down, he saw Olivia and the sailors standing in the clearing 100 or so feet from the tower. They began yelling at him to hurry, brandishing their axes and swords as they did so. Scurrying as fast as he could, Alexander rejoined his men. At the top of the tower platform, several spectres hovered above Ezekiel, who stood watching the party in the clearing below. "It's Ezekiel," began Olivia. "Just run!" Alexander ordered loudly. Ezekiel began to walk down the stairwell. The spectres left him and sailed through the air towards Alexander's party as they ran out of the clearing. The muddy trail slowed their retreat as they sloshed through the rain and high-pressure winds. After several hundred yards, the rain and winds abruptly stopped, but the spectres still hovered over the party, wailing and screeching. Reaching the ice, veiled by the thinly packed snow, Olivia slipped several times. The men kept forward towards the shore, leaving her behind. Alexander turned back to help her up. As he did so, the spectres stopped their pursuit of the men and hovered over Alexander and Olivia. Alexander stood frozen, staring up at the spectres who circled them, wailing in unison. They began chanting in the ancient tongue. "Aikma vatu, Aikma velen, qua tas jeva, und fensu kalesh, Aikma vatu, Aikma velen, Aikma vatu,
Eich marvelen.
Olivia shuddered.
No, no!
Alexander, without taking his eyes off the spectres, asked, You know what they are saying? After a brief pause, noting that she had not verbally responded, she spoke.
I have no idea what they are saying, but I believe this is the danger my master has been looking for.
Alexander briefly glanced at Olivia and turned his gaze back on the spectres. He reached out to touch one of them and they screamed even louder, breaking up their chant. Why did they attack Ezekiel but show us no harm? Olivia pulled her cloak tightly around her neck. Catching herself from slipping again on the ice, she stepped away from Alexander.
Perhaps we could discuss this while we are not surrounded by crying ghosts, yes?
As Olivia started running east towards the shore, Alexander did not seem to hear her. He was confused and fascinated by the inaction of the ghosts. We should be dead, he muttered aloud to himself.
Alexander!
Olivia called to him sharply. Alexander broke from his trance-like gaze and hastened towards Olivia. The spectres again began their pursuit, hovering over Alexander and Olivia as they ran to the ship. The rest of their party was already on the deck of the ship. Alexander could see Honora leaning against the rail of the ship, her eyes wide with terror. D'Artan had the fires lit per Alexander's instructions, with the men armed with bows and arrows at the ready.
Fire at will!
D'Artan ordered the men. Alexander ducked as a volley of arrows flew over their heads.
Idiot!
Bristled Alexander.
You cannot hit ghosts!
As they reached the dock, Alexander hoisted Olivia halfway up the rope railing and began climbing up behind her.
Cast off! Cast off!
Honora grabbed Alexander as he came over the railing, her eyes wide.
Alexander!
Alexander embraced her briefly before turning back towards the island. Not yet! The spectres hovered above the dock, hesitant to move any further. Their shrieks sent chills through the crew. D'Artan moved next to Alexander as the crew scrambled to cast off. What the hell are those things? Amendi. Spectres we found in the tower. We found no people there, only spirits, answered Alexander.
Black magic,
huffed Olivia. She rubbed her hands together and stuck them underneath her cloak.
That tower is pure evil.
As the ship pulled away from the harbour, the Amendi could be seen slowly fading in and out until they completely vanished from sight. The ship hugged the coastline of the southern island for the better part of the day. Alexander and D'Artan agreed it was best they did not set foot ashore until they found proof of human life. There was no guarantee the spectres were not on the island as well. Able to drop anchor for the first time in weeks, the crew of the Gabriella did so, and got some much-needed rest. The deck of the ship was empty as it sat several hundred feet off the shore. The Pavos crew drank heavily, for they had not touched even a snifter of their wine during their voyage. There was more than enough to go around. In between their drinking and prayers, which neither Alexander, Honora, nor Olivia could understand, there was talk of the old gods punishing them for venturing so far into the frozen sea. The gods must have summoned the devils from the deep, D'Artan insisted between rounds. He was much too boisterous that night for Alexander's liking, but the lads had had a hard time of it. He dared not interrupt their merrymaking prayer rituals, or at least that is what Alexander assumed it was. The men were all a whisper about Ezekiel and how he had been possessed. They feared the same would become of them if they stayed around the island for too long. Amendi. They had heard Alexander use that phrase to describe the spirits, and every time the men spoke it, they remarked in hushed tones. Alexander spent much of his time below deck staring at the table, his food and drink untouched. Honora gently played with the locks of his hair, cuddling up next to him. She was taking in her share of the spirits. Olivia sat across from them, eyeing the room back and forth. She would catch a word or two every so often that she recognized from her spymaster's teachings, but most of the ancient common tongue prayers were lost on her. Every time she turned her gaze to Alexander and Honora, she could feel her face tighten.
Why don't you drink wine?
Olivia asked Alexander at random. Alexander broke from his trance of staring at the rather common, rather old bolted table in front of him. He questioned.
Wine,
Olivia continued. She tapped her goblet repeatedly. Why don't you drink it?" Alexander shifted in his chair and sat up. "Oh, I do not much care for the stuff." "Why?" Olivia pressed further, drumming her fingers on the goblet. "Could you not?" snarled Honora, growing aggravated by the repeated clicking of Olivia's fingernails on the brass. Olivia ignored Honora, much to the latter's annoyance. "We've nothing else to do tonight, Alexander. Might as well converse." "Maybe you don't." Alexander smiled sheepishly as she played with Alexander's earlobe. Alexander smirked, removing her hand away from his face. "Later," he murmured in her direction. Turning back to Olivia, he continued, "That is a question easy enough. Simply put, my father has been a whoremongering drunk since I can remember. I have never touched drink because of it." Olivia did not respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to the room. D'Artan was growing louder as the crew around him began to grow silent.
"The sea is the home of the gods. We are fools to ever come here, fat purse or no. Poor Ezekiel is to be left on this rock of ice. What do I tell his wife, his children? Devils rule these lands."
D'Artan continued on for some time, recounting numerous tales of the frozen sea he had heard as a child from his grandfather, who had been a fisherman. He droned on about how the sea was cursed from the time of Barth II because his children did not worship the old gods. Instead, as the 9 grandchildren of Barth spread across the world carving out their kingdoms, they declared themselves gods.
"Risky business elevating oneself to a god," D'Artan quipped. "King's blood does not make you a god."
When one of the crew argued that Barth had been an emperor, D'Artan snapped back. They went back and forth about politics and religion for so long the rest of the men turned back to drinking and talking amongst themselves. Alexander had overstayed his welcome below decks. Not only was the night dragging on, but he was keenly aware of his sobriety around the drunken crew. Politely excusing himself to Olivia, he held Honora by the hand and proceeded above deck to the captain's quarters. "Give us an hour before you retire," Alexander told Olivia matter-of-factly. Honora turned back to Olivia as they headed up the stairs. Winking playfully at Olivia, Honora added, "Or 2."